Hello, welcome back to another installment of Curtis Jones Writing. If you remember last installment, I was reading chapter 11 of Dad's Old Truck, Volume 2. It's one of the longer stories I've written, and it was about 60 pages long. So, to break it down to manageable size, I did 30 pages, and I'm going to do the next 30 pages off of this. If you're in a big hurry to know all these stories, you can go to my web page, which is curtis-jones-books.squarespace.com. And there's a link that'll take you to Amazon where you could download ebooks or buy paperbacks, or some of my books come in hardback. Uh, or you could go to my Facebook page, which is Curtis Jones Author Page uh, on Facebook. And there's a link that'll take you to Amazon to buy books there. Both of these have links that go to the Montgomery Public Library, where I've been producing uh, seminars on how to write and publish your own books. And you can watch it off of their place there. There's a link to take you over there. So let's get back with what we're going to do. If you remember last time I was reading about uh, 60 Hard Hours is the title of the book, 60 Hard Hours. And it's the story about a good friend I made when we moved back to Oklahoma and the trouble we got ourselves into. He got upset with his father and wanted to run away, and I agreed to go with him. So, anyway, if you remember, we left off, we uh, caught a ride up toward Kansas City and then over and caught a ride to Wichita and caught a ride out of Wichita going to Dodge City. And we thought we had a ride from Dodge City on over to Lamar, Colorado, which was our plan to go over there and then down to Texas and then out to California. But things went awry, and there'd been a change in personnel, and instead of an old man that took the route on over to uh, Lamar, a young woman had been hired, and she didn't want two rough-looking teenage boys riding with her to Lamar, Colorado. Let me read the last couple paragraphs, and then we'll pick up from there. So we made the last 15 miles to Dodge City. We were very quiet and just looked at the scenery out our windows. To our surprise, the old gentleman, Dave, that drove the next leg of the newspaper route had been replaced by a young woman. When Jack approached her about giving us a ride to Colorado, she wanted no part of it. It looked like our streak of good luck had just run out. Jack gave us the bad news, and he apologized and he headed back to Wichita with an empty van. It looked like we would have to be hitchhikers once more to continue our trip. It was about 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning when we got to Dodge City. The newspaper drop off was in the middle of town. I thanked Jack for the ride, as did Stanley before he left. We also thanked the woman for having heard Jack's offer. We said our goodbyes and started off down the road. Just then, the young woman's van passed us as she headed toward Colorado. And we looked at each other and gave a deep sigh, as if to say, we should have been on that van. The air was still damp, and it had a bite to it now. It was getting much colder now. We would catch a ride for maybe a mile or even two, and then have to walk another mile or two. This continued between 3 or 4 little towns in West Kansas. The sun refused to shine on us, giving the day a very gloomy feel. The cold air bit at us as we walked through those great long miles between rides. Since the sun refused to shine, the air seemed to sting our skin. We had no gloves, no hats. Our trench coats were not made for the bitter cold. There were no small businesses open in these rural communities on this early Saturday morning, so there was no place to get something to eat or to relieve ourselves. It was between 5 and 8 miles between each of these small towns or small communities as we hitchhiked our way westward. About 9 o'clock in the morning, we came upon a small cafe that was open. We went inside and ordered pancakes and hot cocoa. We stayed there almost an hour trying to warm ourselves because the cold had such a grip on us. The waitress kept watching us, and we were becoming uncomfortable. So we paid our bill and took to the road again. We didn't want to hang around just in case she decided to call the authorities and have the police check us out. It would be bitter to be out in the cold gray morning. Oh, I'm sorry, it would be better to be out in the cold gray morning than to be sitting in a police station. We continued our trek, and about 12 o'clock we came to the state of Colorado. We were so pleased to pass the border. We made a point to step together across the place where the sign stood, and said, "You are entering Colorado," to one another. We caught a ride with an old farmer and his wife in a very old pickup. They stopped just as they passed the border. As we climbed into the bed, we had to hold ourselves near to the cab of the truck because the air screaming past our ears was so cold. This turned out to be the coldest ride we had taken in the whole trip. As we rode, we huddled together as closely as we could to try and escape the intense cold as the frigid wind whipped around in the back of that old truck. I thought we could have frozen to death before we got to the place where he let us get off. But still, this was better than walking that far. He let us off somewhere just outside the outskirts of Lamar, Colorado. You couldn't see the town from where we were. It was a crossroads where a dirt road intersected the highway. There was a small cafe that stood on the corner, and it was open. We were so thankful that this business was open. As we got out of the truck, we walked up to the cab to thank them for their ride. The old gentleman sat very close to his wife, perhaps for the warmth they could give each other, because the inside of that cab felt no warmer than where we were sitting in the bed of that old truck. It made me remember warmer days in the back of Dad's old truck. As we said our goodbyes, the kindly old gentleman warned us that they were off to find a place to get out of the weather because there was an ice storm coming our way. They turned onto the dirt road and headed off toward the horizon, and we never saw them again. We looked at each other and headed toward the restaurant in hopes of getting something that would warm our insides and bring us back to the land of the living. We had no idea what we would do because we were committed to the trip now, and we had to continue traveling until we came to a place we could rest and get out of the weather. As we stood next to the entrance to that little cafe parking lot and extended our thumbs to every car that passed, Stanley recommended that we not take a ride in the back of a pickup again to which I agreed wholeheartedly. I rubbed my hands together briskly to generate a warm or as much heat as I could. I would quickly place them upon my ears. I took turns trying to warm both my ears. As I tried to warm my ears, I remembered I had a pair of gloves in the glove box of my old car back in Stillwell. I wished that I could somehow have them there with me at that time. The thought brought me no comfort because it didn't change our situation, nor did it warm my hands or my ears. After standing there about an hour and a half, the air continued to get colder. There were very few cars. I began to notice the worry on Stanley's face and in his eyes as we noticed the air that we exhaled looked like thick summer clouds. I'm sure I had the same expression on my face that I saw on Stanley's face. Now, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and unable to take the cold anymore, we went into the little cafe and ordered a hamburger and a cup of hot coffee. During the long wait after the last ride, as we stood there in the cold, damp air, we remembered that when you order a cup of coffee, you get free refills. We decided that would be better than ordering hot chocolate and having to pay for every refill. For a 16-year-old boy, a cup of hot coffee with 3 or 4 tablespoons of sugar and twice as much coffee creamer than should be allowed made the coffee tolerable. It also tasted very good, almost like a dessert. While we sat there and sipped our third cup of coffee, a man about 35 years old came in. He was driving a 1955 Buick, a big, bulky, heavy looking car. He said he wanted a cup of coffee to go and that he was headed for Amarillo, Texas, and asked how far that was. Suddenly, Stanley and I were sitting there listening, and our ears immediately caught the words Amarillo, Texas. We were on our feet before the waitress could answer, and Stanley stood directly behind him, and I was next to Stanley. As the waitress brought him his coffee, or his cup of coffee, he took out $1 to pay for it, and we asked him if we could hitch a ride with him to Amarillo. He said, "Are you two boys traveling alone?" We introduced ourselves and told him that we were and said we were headed toward California. We wanted to go down to the catch Highway 66. He told us to come on and get in to the car before he's because he's in a hurry. We were so glad to catch this ride so that we wouldn't have to be out in this cold, nasty weather. We were worried about the ice storm that was headed our way, and with a nice resolution to our upsetting situation, I sat in the front seat, Stanley sat in the back seat as we cruised down the highway. I got a sense we were going very fast. I looked over at the speedometer on that old Buick and it read 100 miles an hour. I had only gone 100 miles an hour one time before in my whole life, and that was riding in my Aunt Ann's brother's brand new Chevy. He had bought a brand new 1958 Chevy Impala SS, and it was a beautiful car. Nevertheless, it was still a bit frightening riding in a car with a man I didn't know. The road had begun to ice up and looked very slick. He looked, he looked like he was upset about something. I don't know whether he knew how to drive on ice or not. He did keep his speed on the icy road, though. That didn't matter as much as the fact that the car was 10 or 12-year-old car. Anything could happen. It didn't seem to bother Stanley, so I didn't say anything either. As we drew near Lamar, we turned south and headed toward the panhandle of Oklahoma and Texas. It was it wasn't long until he was back up to speed again as we crossed into the panhandle, Oklahoma panhandle. It was getting a little darker because the end of the day had come. There was a little town called Boise City, Oklahoma. This little town had a motel, and when our driver saw the motel, he decided he wanted to stop and spend the night. As he began to pull into the motel parking lot, he stopped and let us out of his car, and we thanked him for the ride, and we started walking and had gone only about a quarter mile when the same driver passed us heading south. It became evident he did not want to give us a ride anymore. Perhaps he was worried because of our age and didn't want to have two runaways in his car. We will never know why he left us there. We walked to the edge of town, and it was maybe an hour before dark. By now, a light sleet had begun to fall, and the road looked like it might ice over even more. We began to talk about going back to the motel we had walked away from and getting a room if darkness came, and the road kept getting worse. At that moment, two Bob trucks pulled up and stopped and asked Stanley if we wanted a ride. They said one of you can ride in the front truck and one of you in the back truck, to which we both agreed and climbed into our respective trucks because they were already two people in each truck when they stopped. These guys were of Hispanic descent and asked Stanley if he would buy them a case of beer if they gave him the money, to which Stanley agreed. It seemed that none of these fellows had driver's license, so they couldn't buy their own beer. I don't know how Stanley did it, but he went into that liquor store and came out with a case of beer for each truck. All this happened on the outskirts of this little city in Oklahoma. As these fellows drove southward toward Amarillo, I kind of leaned back in the seat and tried to nap. Even if they offered, I didn't want any beer. I didn't like the taste. Stanley was evidently having a good time in the front truck because when they had let us off at the truck stop in Amarillo, Stanley was drunk. I took Stanley into the bathroom at the truck stop and tried to sober him up as much as I could. We went into the restaurant and had 3 or 4 cups of coffee in hopes that that would sober him up. After about an hour, Stanley calmed down and did not appear to be intoxicated anymore. At about that time, a man in his 40s came into the truck stop to get a cup of coffee and one to go. And he sat down at the booth next to us. I heard him tell the waitress he was going to California and he would be driving straight through to Bakersfield. That caused me to pay a great deal of attention to everything that was said in the booth next to me. And as he spoke to the waitress, it had worked once before to catch a ride with a coffee shop. So why not this time? By this time, I became quite bold in seeking a ride. I did not like standing on the side of the road with sleet hitting my face, with my hands freezing and my feet numb from the cold. I turned across the booth behind me and facing him, I asked him if we could have a ride with him to California. I told him that we were headed, that's where we were headed. In fact, we were going to Modesto to be precise. He said he knew where Modesto was and that he would be glad to give us a ride. He looked forward to having some company on the long trip. When we went out to the car, he had a brand new 1965 Chevy Impala SS. It was a beautiful car. It was bright red and white interior with not a scratch on it. I got into the back seat and sat down when then Stanley sat on the passenger side in the front. As we left Amarillo, we spoke a little bit, but not much, and Stanley leaned his head back and drifted off to sleep. When I looked at it in retrospect, I don't believe he had gone to sleep, but in fact passed out from the beer that he had drank earlier. We hadn't driven for a couple of hours when Stanley began to stretch his legs forward, and I heard a horrible sound as if some large plastic piece had broken. My heart sank as I heard the driver exclaim, "You just broke my car," in a loud and ear jarring voice as he screamed those awful words. He was as angry as I had ever seen anybody get. I think that we were lucky in the timing of this happening. We were just on the outskirts of a town called Tucumcari, New Mexico. Our benefactor slammed on his brakes and nearly caused the car to slide off the road as he came to a stop. He pulled onto the right side of the road and exclaimed in no uncertain terms that we were to leave his car. This happened just on the outskirts of town. As we exited the car, he began to yell at us in the most foul language, telling us that we were ungrateful, careless, and did not deserve another ride. I apologized to him two or three more times as he peppered us with insults. I felt so bad that this happened to such a nice man and such a pretty car. I also understood that Stanley could not help himself because he had been exposed to alcohol earlier that day. It was simply a very bad turn of events, and we would have to deal with it. I don't know if Stanley had broken more than just the plastic cover on his heater housing, but I do know it was not broken before we got into that car. I think sometime what I think sometimes what if Stanley had rode in the back and I had rode in the front? We might have gone all the way to California with that man. Personally, I was kind of glad that we landed in Tucumcari, New Mexico. On the road from Oklahoma to California, it was the least expensive place to get a motel room. It seemed the whole town was given over to an abundance of motel rooms as their primary business. Given the condition Stanley was in and our exhausted state and how long it had been since we had slept in a bed, I was glad to be here. Stanley and I walked about a quarter mile when we came to a motel that was made to look like teepees. We went into the office and rented a room for the night. I went next door and ordered two hamburgers, two fries, and two pops. I brought it back to the room for Stanley and I to enjoy. Stanley had the TV on and was leaned back in one of the beds. I set our dinner on the little table and we sat there and ate dinner watching TV in what seemed like a new invention to those old road weary eyes. I know that it had not been 48 hours since we left Stillwell, but this was the first real sense of relaxation and rest that I had felt since we left. We didn't have a chance or a change of clothes, but we showered anyway. I still felt somewhat freshened up when I brought our dinner back from the restaurant. I carried it in a small box. We then took one of the flaps off of the box and I wrote the words California on that little flap. We decided that this would be the easiest way to get a ride all the way to California. Our spirits were lifted as we relaxed in the bright, comfortable, and warm motel room. It was the first time that I was not afraid of being killed in a car wreck or attacked by some madman or even robbed of what little I had. I don't think Stanley thought about those things, not even once. We rested quite leisurely the whole night long in peace and comfort. The sun rose on the third day in the morning, the first we've seen of it since we left Oklahoma. It felt like a new start, a new beginning, and that our luck had made a turn for the better. Our spirits were high as we went next door to the restaurant to order breakfast. We had a large breakfast that would have satisfied even a lumberjack. Our spirits were high as we picked up our sign off of the table and headed out to Highway 66, which ran through the middle of town. We were smiling and joking and punching each other in the shoulder and talking about what it would be like when we get to California. All the heavy weather and bad conditions had passed us by, and we were in the sunshine now. We stood on the shoulder of the road and we held our little cardboard sign that read California to every car that came our direction. We were sure that someone going directly to Modesto would stop and pick us up, and we would be the last, it would be the last ride we would have to solicit before we were at my sister Betty's house. When there were no cars coming, I would hold the sign down at my side, and when a car came, I would immediately hold up the sign so it could be read. We had been at the roadside about 10 minutes or so when a very recognizable car came our direction. I had been holding the sign up for the car in front of him, but now a police car was coming our direction. Stanley said, "Put the sign down. That's a cop car." I told Stanley it was too late. He had already seen the sign, and if I pull it down now, he will think something was wrong. So I stood my ground and I held the sign up as the police officer drove by. I looked at Stanley and said, with a smirk on my face, "See, if I had pulled the sign down, he would have pulled in and asked us questions." But before I finished making this statement, the police officer had turned around and pulled back up alongside us. He rolled down his window and didn't say a word. He picked up a clipboard and he looked at Stanley and he looked at me and he started describing what Stanley was wearing down to his beetle boots. And he turned his attention to me and did the same thing. This officer was way smarter than two 16-year-old boys, and he knew what he was doing. When he looked at me in the face, he asked a simple question. He said, "Why did you boys run away from home?" I said, with all the wisdom I could muster, looking him straight in the face, "Why? Do you have something on us?" I believe that may have been the wrong thing, or worst thing I could have said to a police officer when I think about it looking back. The officer simply responded to my question with his statement: "Get into the back of the cruiser, boys." Expressions of joy had disappeared from his face. Oh, I'm sorry. Get into the back of the cruiser, boys. Stanley's expression of Joy had disappeared from his face, and I'm sure it did off of my face too. I opened the door to the police car and slid in first because I was holding the sign. Stanley followed me almost immediately, and the officer reached out of his window and shut the door. The sound of the door closing jarred my ears. It made my heart drop to the pit of my stomach. As I sat there in the back of the police cruiser, I looked at the door, and there was no handle on the inside so that we might get away. There stood a cage between me and the front seat of the police car that would prevent me from climbing into the front seat. I may not have known it at that moment, but we were already trapped. As we sat in the back seat of that police car, the officer made a radio call to the station and he described Stanley and myself to his sergeant. The sergeant asked him to bring us in for questioning. It wasn't long before we were at the police station, maybe 8 or 10 blocks. Then we were asked to get out and come into the station with him. When we entered the station, the sergeant met us at the door and asked the officer to drive us over to the juvenile detention building and check us in. Stanley and I never said a word to each other. We simply complied with every request the officer made. As we entered the building, they had us stand in front of a camera that measured our height on the wall, and they took our photograph. They then took us through 2 sets of locked doors and into a large dormitory room. It was a cell that had bunks lining the walls from the floor to the ceiling. Young men and boys like Stanley and myself occupied many of the bunks. There was not much to do in this room. It was so very simple and plain. It had a bench that ran the length of the room in the middle or in the center, and bunks that lined the walls that could be folded up to make more room. Everything in the room was painted a dusty, sandy color. At one end of the room, there was a window that looked outside, but you could not see the ground because it was too high on the wall. The other end of the room, there was a bathroom with 2 sinks, 2 stalls, and 2 showers. I had mixed emotions about having been put in jail, juvenile hall, and I had the relief that I felt knowing I would be going home soon. Stanley and I were each given top bunks next to each other, so we were still able to talk. The look on Stanley's face said that he had a sense of relief as well. We talked about how angry our parents were going to be when we get to see them face to face. I told Stanley that my father would kill me if not worse. We both shared the uneasy laugh as we talked about what we would face when we were once again in Oklahoma. I told Stanley I was afraid my father would sell my car because of what I had done. I was afraid that it would make him very angry with me. We spent that day close together and quietly avoiding other inmates. There was no TV in the room, there was no music piped in, there was no reading material. It seemed like it was designed to give you a sense of isolation, and it did that quite well. They brought us in navy beans and biscuits for lunch, and for supper, we had red beans and cornbread. To tell you the truth, we had eaten so little on this trip that both were good meals to me. The boys on the bunk straight across the room from Stanley and me had a cigarette lighter and he held it to the ceiling, painting it with the black soot that came off of his lighter. I asked him if he were trying to set the building on fire, and uh, his response was that he was writing his name. I asked him if he thought they would know who did it, and he said he didn't care. Then darkness came and the lights were turned out. Uh, we could hear younger boys crying themselves to sleep. Stanley and I felt like doing the same thing. I didn't know how long I would be in this juvenile hall, and I didn't want others to tease me. This night was not as long as either of the nights we had spent hitchhiking, but it was long enough. It may have been warm and dry, but it was still very uncomfortable. The next morning, one of the guards came by the cell and I asked him what Stanley and I had been charged with. His response was that there is there was no charge against runaways. I asked if we could be let go, and he said, when your parents collect you. My dad said he would not send a bus ticket to bring me home. But I thank God for Stanley's father because he sent two bus tickets to bring us both back to Stillwell from New Mexico. The officer in charge the officer in charge of the juvenile detention area took Stanley and myself into the interview room and set us down. He told us that my father would not send a bus ticket to bring me home. He said that they would have to they would have had to keep me until I had turned 18 years old if I did not get a ticket home. That is what would happen to me. Then he took Stanley's, then he looked at Stanley and said, your father has sent you a ticket to Oklahoma City. That is where he will pick you up when you arrive. He then looked at me and said, young Mr. Jones, consider yourself lucky that Mr. Lawley has sent a bus ticket for you as well. Stanley and I were held in the interview room until 11 o'clock in the morning. Then the police officer that had carried us to the detention area took us to the bus station and put us on an eastbound Greyhound bus. As Stanley and I rode that Greyhound toward Oklahoma City, we didn't talk much to each other because of the anticipation of what we would face. The bus made many stops on the way to Oklahoma City, and didn't get there until 6 o'clock in the morning. As the bus pulled up to the station, we were looking out the window to see if our parents were there to meet us. Mine were not, but Stanley's father was there with his girlfriend. At that moment, my heart was overjoyed that someone cared enough to be there. Mr. Lawley was overjoyed to see Stanley safe and not harmed. He met us at the offloading and gave Stanley a big hearty pat on the back. Mr. Lawley then shook my hand and said that he was happy to see us both safe and sound. We were awful. We were an awful sight. We had worn the same clothes for 5 days and were wrinkled and looked than the wear, worse for the wear. We walked into the bus station and sat down at the cafe and ordered breakfast. As they brought our food and set it in front of us, we began to eat. I was very nervous because I had not eaten in a restaurant except with Stanley, and I was afraid I would look foolish. So I was very careful as I cut the big slab of ham into bite sized pieces. The first cut went fine, but the second cut pulled the slab of meat off the platter and it squarely onto my lap. I became so embarrassed I got up and placed the ham on the plate and walked to the bathroom and tried to clean off the grease to no avail. I returned to the table and didn't eat another bite. I waited until I got home to eat. Shame can be such a cruel master. When Stanley's father got back to Stillwell, he called my father and asked him to come to pick me up there in town. My mother and father came down to meet me in the Stillwell Cafe where they had agreed to pick me up. Dad came in and thanked Mr. Lawley for getting me home. They shook hands and Dad escorted me out to the car. As we drove away from the cafe, I asked Dad if I needed to go to school to pick up my car. He shook his head and asked me to hand him my car keys, and he said I would not be driving my car for some time. As we left the small town of Stillwell and headed out toward Workman Mountain, Dad began to inform me what he thought of me as a son. It did not feel good. Nothing he said on that trip home would have made a person happy to come back home. I knew Dad had been hard on me most of my life, but I began to see what he really thought of me on that ride from Stillwell to my home. It was only 15 miles, but it changed my life more than the hundreds of miles I traveled when I ran away. Mom really didn't say much, but the disappointment on her face spoke volumes more than the words that my father said. Her eyes seemed to say, "Why would you do this?" All the words my father said to me were things I had heard from him before over many years, but it was strange to hear them all said at one time. Only one statement stuck deeply, and that was the reason he did not send a bus ticket. He hoped that they would keep me until I was 18 years old. I didn't know what I don't know why he had such disdain for me until I had 4 children myself, and at that time he explained that he thought I was not his son. Those words cut my heart deeper than anything he had ever said, and it changed my relationship with him forever. Dad told me that I would not be a friend to Stanley anymore, that he would decide when I could have access to my car, and that I was grounded until further notice. Within a month of this incident, the family farm on top of Workman Mountain went back to the bank. The entire deal Dad had with the bank was for nothing because the corporation headquarters refused to accept the transfer of the ownership of the property from the bank to my father. I don't know how much money he had to put into it, nor do I know the effort he made to keep it. But I know that was the reason for his short temper and his quick reaction when I had run away from home. Still no excuse. When we had to move off of that property, we moved 11 miles north into another school district in the state of Arkansas. I attended school at Lincoln High School the rest of that year. I'm not sure if I ever saw Stanley again after I started school in Arkansas. But by the end of the next summer break, we would be moving to California again. I had always remembered my friend Stanley Lawley and missed him from time to time and wondered what has happened to him. I wonder if he ever thinks of me and that unbelievable adventure we had during the 60 hard hours in late October 1965. Thank you for your time. That was the second part of 60 hard hours. It was a long chapter, and I couldn't get it all into one uh, recording, so I wanted to do it in two. I hope you enjoyed it. I have other stories. The next chapter I'll be talking about is Lincoln High School. And there's some funny stories in that. I hope you enjoy them. Next posting will have that on it. God bless you. Take care. Like this video and share it with your friends. Goodbye.